Hello, everybody, and welcome to Behind the Camera. The road to 100 continues here on Behind the Camera with episode 94. And before we get into today's show, my book, Behind the Camera, The Journey So Far, is out now. Thank you to everybody who has picked up a copy already. And if you would like to grab a copy for yourself, the book is available on Amazon in both paperback and Kindle, and also free to read with Kindle Unlimited. If you would like to see more of the behind-the-scenes side of the podcast, you can also support the show on Patreon. For £3 a month, you'll get access to extra content, including a Patreon-exclusive series, your name added to the wall of patrons at the end of every episode of Behind the Camera, and much more. And finally, if you'd like to follow the show across social media, you can find my link tree in the description. That'll take you to Instagram, TikTok, X, YouTube, and even the merch store. But now, getting into today's conversation. This week, my guest is Lorie Kleiner Eckert. Lorie lives her life through her love of words. The printed word through her books, the spoken word through her time as a motivational speaker, and the quilted word through her hobby of quilting. Through all this, Lorie has learned many life lessons which she aims to teach others, namely embracing our flawsome, rejecting perfectionism, and celebrating therapy as a stigma-free tool to better oneself. I personally really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too. So now, here's the interview. Lorie, welcome to Behind the Camera podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. How are we doing today?
I am just fine in Cincinnati, Ohio. We don't have snow like many of our East Coast friends.
I've heard at this moment in time, it's been pretty bad. There's been a lot of blizzards, especially around the sort of eastern side as well. So thankfully you're staying safe and away from it all. That's always a good thing.
I have a friend who's in Providence, Rhode Island, and they have 37.9 inches of snow. What do you do with that much snow? I can't imagine.
Yeah,
It'll be 2 years before they can remove that.
Absolutely. No, I don't think there'd be a lot of people housebound for the next while there. It sounds like my days. So yes, Lorie, you are an author of 5 books. You've worked in the motivational industry for such a long time, and you are a lover of words, and in what you've written down as whether it be the written word, spoken word, or quilted word. And that is something that I really cannot wait to dive into today. So let's start. So you are an author. You've written 5 books over the course of over 30 years. So what can you tell us then about like your background in writing and how you got into this field, first of all?
Yeah, my background in writing doesn't really exist, and oddly, it was after I published after my second book was published by Pelican Publishing Company. It was after that second book that I thought, oh, I like to write. So I really started writing after my second book. Crazy. And where I started with all the journey, so this will give you the quilted word as well, is I started with a divorce in 1994. Had been a stay-at-home mom for 1,000 years, and I thought I would turn my hobby of quilt making into a paid profession, and that I would make quilts with words pieced into the design. And my original goal was to take the quilts to quilt groups. That's a no-brainer. But unfortunately, quilt groups don't pay very much money for a speaker. They paid like $75 a pop, and I needed more than that. So the words that came out on the quilts, as I made these quilts, I just made whatever I needed to say in that rough transition from 21 years of marriage to being on my own. I just wrote what I needed to say. So one quilt says bloom, another says soar, another says come as you are, you're lovely. There's one that says change is with a period because I felt guilty being divorced, but that quilt is embellished with a pattern called ocean waves. And so, like the ocean waves, roll out and roll in and roll out and roll in, and they change and they change and they change. No need to feel guilty. So I wrote on the quilts what I needed to say, and then realized after 12 quilts were made that they worked together to tell
Mm-hmm.
one story about the journey towards self-acceptance and self-love, and that was a message that wasn't just for quilters. So I really thought that my message was inspirational, but that sounded religious. And so I called myself a motivational speaker and did all this cold calling to line up events. And I spoke to every kind of group from PTAs, that's Parent Teacher Association here in the U.S., from PTAs to Procter and Gamble. And I convinced Pelican Publishing Company to create a book around my quilts. So it's not how to, there's no patterns in the book. It's just a series of vows I made to myself as illustrated with quilts. And those series of vows are really pretty cool. They start off, I love you is the sequel. With acceptance and love of the self, the story that must come first. And toward the lofty goal of love, I journey forth today, making these vows to myself. So bloom and soar and all those kinds of things. So it was really a neat book. I'm still extremely proud of it. And like I say, took it over a 10-year period. I spoke to over 200 audiences in 11 states here in the United States. And but my groups wanted me to come back and do a second show, so I created a second series of quilts. And this time, instead of just kind of having vows I would make to myself, I did a picture and 1,000 words. So each quilt came with an essay of 1,000 words. And that's when I figured out that I like to write. So
That's
when my
incredible. That's
it
incredible.
is.
Yeah, because it's quite interesting, especially with your your second book, being like with your illustrations of your quilts, your designs with the essays. I was actually speaking to somebody recently, and to sort of tie it to the theme of storytelling, like just it's like you say, a picture paints 1,000 words, and all you need is like say take your first group of quilts, one word, and that kind of like sets the theme. The design kind of helps really tell the rest of the story. And do you create the designs yourself as well when you're quilting, like the imagery on them? Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
do.
yeah.
I designed all the quilts,
Mm-hmm.
what they needed to say, and then how you might illustrate that. So for instance, in the second book, there's a quilt that says "Gather all you can," which is not material things, but the story behind it had been that I had gone to a new student orientation at my oldest child when he was going off to college, and they talked about all the activities you could become involved in, sports and clubs and a job and all kinds of things that you can do, and that the opportunity just were vast. And the guy closed his remarks with "Gather all you can." And so I thought, oh, gather all you can. What a great message. But when I'm trying to illustrate it, what do you gather? So I had the image of an armful of flowers. So there are flowers on the quilt, and gather all you can. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you can see I was never, so I've done motivation for 30 years. My MO has always been to tell the stories of my life and hope you can glean a life lesson from them. And it's not rocket science. I'm not talking about anything too advanced. It's just like gather all you can. There's lots of opportunities out there, lots of experiences. Go get it. I just thought that was a brilliant way to release a bunch of college freshmen out into the world.
Of course, and that's the amazing thing about it, though, because when it comes to storytelling, like every single, I live by this. Like it's that the fact that every single person has a story to tell, and there's always going to be at least one person who'll have something to take from that. Like no matter who it is, there's always going to be a lesson that somebody can learn from it, or something that somebody can resonate with, on in a story. Like, and that's like the fascinating thing, and obviously that does kind of come with some adversity at times, where there are times, like yourself, it took your divorce to sort of you get into this kind of field, motivational speaking, based on your story, your lessons learned and everything like that. But even through that, it's like storytelling is kind of something that kind of helps you really kind of learn about your experiences after having lived them, and then kind of be able to sort of put them out there and be like, this is what happened, and I learned from it and I came out much, much better out of it. And what better way to do that than through a creative art?
I agree with you. And um, so in High on Life, the new book, it's 36 stories of my life, but the back, about 8 pages, are lined pages because you too have stories of your life and you have a story to tell, and it's so valid and it's so important, and someone is going to learn something from it. And also, I tell people at the end of High on Life to check my website, loriekleinereckert.com, regularly, because with each story, I'm posting writing prompts so that they can write their story. And I wrote a story called That Time I Needed a Husband. And it was when the pipes froze and broke in the basement, and the basement was flooded when the springtime came. And then on the writing prompt, I said, write about a terrible time in your life, a missed plane, a fender bender, whatever, and how you can tell the story now differently. We all go through adversity, as you were saying, and we can be a little bit of a Pollyanna and take this message away from it. Yeah.
Definitely. And I think with that, you've got that element of relatability too, which is so important, for people whenever they're hearing a story, or they even want to get their story out. Like, you put this out on your website, about your frozen pipes, your flooded basement. It's like, this is my day. How's your day going? Tell
Yeah.
me about your bad experiences. But that creates that kind of level of empathy, I think, that really kind of allows us as people to sort of like lower our guard and kind of allow that kind of connection. And I just think it's something that helps humanity thrive, personally.
Yeah, I do too. And uh, I just feel that people often say that, that when they'll read my stories, they feel like I'm sitting right there talking just to them or whatever. And I like that. I
Yeah.
like that a lot. And I often say, beyond my MO is to tell the stories of my life, hoping you can glean life lessons. But beyond that, I think I work as a cheerleader with the message that life is difficult, but you can do it. And it is. And I think, a lot of people don't allow you to know that life is difficult. They
For
always
sure.
want, is your is your glass half empty, or is it, half full?
Yeah.
Well, sometimes it's really pretty empty, and that's okay. And I'm the one to, because I'll remind you that it'll fill up again.
Of course.
I always joke that often when I'm down in the dumps, one of my friends will suggest to me that I read one of my books. But that's good because I am the cheerleader, and I
Yeah.
have to be reminded to be it for myself. And really, I have fallen into black holes in my life emotionally. And one of the stories in High on Life is about that I don't think that there's anything wrong with going for emotional counseling, to talk to a therapist. And, there's nothing wrong with that. So I
No.
tell my own story of doing that. And people say to me, how can you be so open about all this? Like, what's wrong about talking about that? There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong about talking about that. And so, I mean, there are plenty of stories in my life that I would not write about that I would not tell you about, but there are plenty that that are, and going for counseling is fine with
Oh
me.
yeah.
It's just fine. Yeah, and that story ends up with in the US there's a suicide prevention hotline, so it ends up with that number because
Mm.
lots of people get there from time to time and want to help. Yeah.
Well, that's it. That yeah, and it's a very important thing I think to stress because there are a lot of people who don't feel like they can speak about their issues. There are a lot of people who don't feel like they can go and talk to somebody, whether well, it could be for any possible reason. Yeah, honestly, people just sort of there is this like mental block about opening up about your feelings and talking about it, whether it be uncertain as to why you feel this way about a certain thing, or whether it be just a case of I'm sure this will pass, and sometimes that and unfortunately it does get to the point where it can be too late before you go and do anything. So I think it's an incredibly important message to spread to people that it is okay. Like 100% is okay. If anything, it's encouraged. Like, I mean, people get their cars checked and serviced every year. Why not go and do that with your have like a little mental health check, even if you feel okay? You know, treat your brain, treat your mind like the machine that it is. It just needs a bit of tender loving care sometimes, and that's perfectly okay to go and do that. So with you being a motivational speaker for 10 years as well, you cover topics such as the journey towards self-acceptance and love and having the courage to say yes to life. So it kind of ties into what we were just talking about there by going
Mhm.
and addressing how you feel and really kind of opening up like that. Would you say that these are kind of lessons learned from like the end of your marriage and the start of your career in terms of doing this?
I, you know, I think that it was just general life. I
Mm-hmm.
think that, I'm the kind of person who always say wonderful quotes and things like that. So, I just may be not remembering correctly because that divorce of mine happened 1,000 years ago in 1994, and we are just so healed as a family. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
my ex-husband and I, we have 3 adult children and 10 grandchildren, and we all live within a 5 mile radius of each other. And we go to soccer games and we go to cheerleading events and we go to dance recitals all the time. So we really get along. So maybe I'm not exactly remembering, but I mean, I think clearly in the first book, I was giving myself a pep talk, changes. So it's
Mm-hmm.
okay to have changed. And in the second book, I don't know what, I went through a phase where I was more business oriented, it was
Yeah.
like one step at a time towards reaching that goal, which over the years has morphed into one step at a time uh, to reinvent yourself, because we do reinvent ourselves over and over and over again. So that had been, that was certainly a reinvention after divorce, but so was it a reinvention when my first child was born or when I graduated from college. I had to reinvent myself. There was a new
Yeah.
definition of who I was. And so that one step at a time becomes extremely important to me at this point in time, a message that I like to say to my grandkids. But yeah, so I don't know that I've been so focused on my own challenges as just a generic something. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I get what you mean. Yeah, like
So
it's something that's kind of always been embedded in you, sort of like for as long as
yes,
you can
yes,
remember. Yeah, I
yeah,
understand. Yeah,
yeah. So I was just putting out the general stuff. Now, my fourth book really was dealing with a problem.
yeah.
And you'll love this problem because it has a UK tie-in. So,
Oh yes, I've
so
looked into this one. I'm very excited to hear about this one. By the way, I know it covers a heavy topic, but I think it's just a very fascinating way of writing. But obviously, I will let you talk about this.
So I like to say that when people go, so that we have all these reinventions in life, and even the good reinventions, getting a college degree is a challenge. What comes next? But when we have a bad reinvention, which is we get fired or we get divorced or the death of a loved one or whatever, that's still a reinvention, but it's a little bit dicey. And I like to say that often when people go through one of those kinds, especially a breakup or divorce or whatever, that we might do something very odd. We might take up alcohol or drugs or promiscuity. So when my significant other passed away, we called him Big Irv, which says a lot about him right there. When Big Irv died after a very 4-year-long illness that was crazy, because he was the kind of guy who cussed out doctors, so it was a little bit embarrassing to be his significant other. But anyway, when he died, it wasn't alcohol, it wasn't drugs, it wasn't promiscuity. I turned to, no, not me, I turned to a crush on British actor Bill Nye. And so in the U.S., I have to say, not Bill Nye, the science guy, Bill Nye, the British actor guy. And then I remind them that he was in Love Actually in the UK. The last time I was in London, he was doing the commercials for, I think we call it TJ Maxx here, and maybe you call it TK Maxx.
TK Maxx, yes.
So he was, he's everywhere, but in the US, they don't necessarily know him. So I had a crush on him, and I went to see him on Broadway, and he was magnificent. He was actually nominated for an award, though. Foolishly, they didn't give it to him. I mean, really, what were they thinking? Of course, he was the best. But anyway, I went to see him on Broadway. And afterwards, my friend said to me, do you want to stand at the stage door and get an autograph? And it's like, well, yeah, but how embarrassing. So I said, nah, let's just go on. But I'm a writer, so I wrote him a note telling him basically I loved him and how wonderful he was in the play. And I sent it to the theater because the theater, he was going to be performing there for months. So my friend, her son's name is Ben Newland. So one day, a couple of weeks after sending my love letter to Bill Nye, I get a letter in the mail from BN. I'm thinking, why is Ben Newland writing to me? And I opened it up, and it was from Bill Nye.
Wow.
Oh my God, I was astounded, delighted, thrilled. And he thanked me, for my letter, and I got the autograph, and but he sprinkled his little note with 3 X's, and I'm a great researcher, so I go to the computer. Is an X a universal sign for a kiss? And it is. So the man sent me 3 kisses, So I was sure that he was experiencing love at first right, not sight, but right. And so in my craziness, as I was, working through my loss with Big Irv, you have to do things to stay busy, and so I, being the frugal person that I am, went to the public library and checked out all of his movies. And I had my own brand of Saturday night at the movies. That's what I did instead of having a date for Saturday night. Oh, I did with Bill Nye, my boyfriend. And it's funny, Pete, whenever he puts out something new, all my friends are the first to write me. He's got a podcast. Do you know he's got a podcast?
Oh, really?
He does.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, you have to check into that.
Definitely,
but really, to your listeners, they have to stick here with you instead. But behind the camera, it's definitely. But anyway, so in the book Love, Loss, and Moving On, I do not teach my method for personal reinvention. I do that in High on Life, and that's a 2-step little proposition, but I show you how to do it. And so you have to be busy and you have to be doing meaningful things moving towards your new life. In my case, I got back to writing. I hadn't been writing, so now I was writing again. And I ended up writing this whole book about Bill Nye. And I wrote him many more letters in the book. Most of them I didn't send because come the morning, they were just a little too embarrassingly ridiculous, but they're all in the book. And it was fun. And anyway, I would still love him to love me, but I don't know, got any good advice in that direction?
Oh, I would be the last person to be able to give advice on that, I'm afraid. That's such an incredible story. Like, and I mean, I think it's very much testament, like you say, when, you know, your mind goes to so many weird and wonderful places when you are in a sort of reinvention transition, or when like a sort of life changing event kind of happens, like people turn to different things, and that has to be one of the most unique things I've ever heard, and it's fantastic. Like, it's such a fantastic story. And so the way that you've described it is like a part memoir, part unauthorized biography on the. So
Mhm.
how do you sort of combine the two things together to create your story?
Yeah, well, so after my second book, when I discovered that I liked writing, I started to write. Back then, it was a column. Now it's a
Mm-hmm.
blog. But I started to write a column about being single in midlife. And again, cheerleader. I know you don't want to be, but I know you can handle it. And so, and I syndicated that to little newspapers across the country, and they had to know how much space to leave for me. So I always wrote 750 words, Andy, never 749, never 751. Sometimes I had to hyphenate two words that don't usually get hyphenated, but I made it to 750 words. So I'm used to writing in little snippets,
Mm-hmm.
in little pieces. And so I guess that's where I was. So what not high on life, love, loss, and moving on is a lot of little chapters. So there the my letter to him is a chapter, his letter to me is a chapter. But I also have journal entries so that you hear what's going on in my regular life. I also have Saturday Night at the Movies, so I write reviews of all of his wonderful movies, and they were astounding to me because there were so many of them are historical fiction. And I learned things like pirate radio. Who knew that in the UK you couldn't play rock music in whatever era that was? So they broadcast from the middle of the ocean. Who knew these things? I certainly didn't. So I wrote about, I would watch a movie and write about it. So those were chapters. And by the way, when I would write about the movie, I would say if he had been in a movie with that person before, oh, he got to play with his friend again. Remember, they were together in this other movie. So I was very happy for him that he had friends. But anyway, so yeah, so I alternate. And then I also had been writing this column. So monthly, there was a column that I wrote. And in the US, we had a show called Doogie Howser a million years ago about a very young man, but he looked so young and he was brilliant. And so he became a doctor really fast.
Yeah.
And every episode, he solved whatever medical mystery. But at the end, he always wrote a little essay that was so meaningful when you knew what had happened before. And so that's the way the blogs or columns in Love, Loss, and Moving On are. You just saw me go through all this, and this is how I distilled it into a nice little lesson. And so, yeah, so there's movie reviews, there's diary entries, there's letters to him, there's columns, and it happens over about 5-6 months is all from when I saw him on Broadway to when I wished him well. But that is, you know, but that's the reality of going through a loss, is
Mm-hmm.
that every day you're getting better.
Yeah.
And so over all those many months, um, like by the end, it was like, well, it's Saturday night. Should I watch a Bill Nye movie? Or maybe I'll go to the bookstore. Or maybe I'll take myself out to dinner. So I was feeling clearly better. Again, this isn't a how to reinvent yourself,
Mhm.
but it is me demonstrating how I did.
Yeah.
And before too long, I had no use for Bill Nye anymore. I was living, I was living my full life again. But that's really what it's all about. This may not work the same way in UK as it works here. But I did a podcast with a guy who's a real estate person for senior citizens. So that's how I fit in with him. But if you've ever owned a house in the United States, you have a mortgage booklet. And on day one, every cent, almost every cent that you pay into your monthly payment goes to the interest on the loan, and just a smidge goes towards paying down the principal.
Mhm.
But over 30 years of the loan, by the end of the loan, almost nothing's going to interest and everything's going to principal. And so I said to him, which is really so true. I think this is a story in my third book, which has an odd name. I need a man's pants to wash. Anyway, but but your loss and your grief is like that. It's all
Yeah.
consuming at the beginning. And by the end, it's still there, but it's so much more manageable and you've got so much of the other good stuff going on. So that's what you see when you read Love, Loss, and Moving On. You see me bereft on the sofa crying at the start, and you see me a little bit crazy in the middle, and then ready to move on with my life by
Mm.
the end. Yeah, yeah. I said I think the closing letter was really lovely. I wish I could quote it fully, but it's yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, your movies and interviews comforted me, and that was what it was.
Yeah. That's incredible though, like, because that's such a unique concept to sort of combine those two things and journal that into your experience and really kind of tell your story and, like, you know, unashamedly just be like, this is how I moved on. This is how I dealt with grief. This is how I dealt with a really horrible time in my life. And that's okay to do that. And, I think it's, because like you say, everybody has their own way of dealing with grief. And I think that's undoubtedly one of the most creative ways I've ever heard of dealing with grief. Genuinely speaking, like, that is incredible. um, so, like, you mentioned as well that it was really by the time you wrote your second book that you realized your love of writing, and then you very briefly mentioned your third book, "I Need a Man's Pants to Wash," which is a very interesting title. Very interesting title. But this came from 52 columns that you had wrote for dozen Jewish newspapers across the country, like you also briefly mentioned. So, um, how did this come to be? So these are like little slice of life stories at 750 words that you mentioned as well. Like, how did you get into sort of writing these alone and sending them across the country?
Yeah. Well, it was a different time. It was like it was right around year 2K. It was, the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. And I think that book came out in 2001. So it was a compilation of the first year worth of columns. And things were different back then. Well, first of all, again, it was a column, it wasn't a blog.
Yeah.
And it was the early days of the internet. So I had the idea. A friend of mine writes a slice of life column, so I had to do something slightly different. So mine was going to have being single in midlife. And then I was going to send it to Jewish newspapers because I'm Jewish, and I know that there are Jewish newspapers all over the country, which is a very defined group, and they have their own American Jewish Press Association, so all this kind of stuff. And so I was able to go. Again, it was the early days of the internet, so
Mm-hmm.
I could go to the American Jewish Press Association's website, and without being a member or anything, if I'm remembering correctly, I mean, I ultimately joined, but I don't think I did in the early days. I I was able to get the names of all the newspapers and the publisher and the editor and the email address. And all of the papers were different. Some of them only published once a month, some published weekly. And so I just, started cold calling the same way that I had, I'm really emailing,
Yeah.
but it was the same methodology that I had with my cold calling to sell myself as a motivational speaker. And I just started sending it out, and one success led to another. But this is a funny story that my local Jewish newspaper, I had written a story that had been published in a major magazine. I wanted my local Jewish newspaper to reprint it. But the guy says to me, "No, you have to come in and talk to me. Let's not do it over the phone." So I go in to talk to him, and think of this as a creative. I go in to sell him one article, and he doesn't want the one article. He wants me to write weekly, and he's going to pay me. He's going to pay me for this. A writer is like mind-boggling. So we shake on it, and I go home and I write him three, stories, lickety split, and he announces it in his newspaper that starting in April, I'm going to be his new columnist. Oh my God, I was thrilled. So on the basis of that, I told all these other
Yeah.
newspapers, I've got this gig. I'm going to appear weekly. Well, the funny thing is that somehow, even though he announced that he was going to start publishing me, and even though he had three of my stories that were good, that were in hand, he never published me.
No
He
way.
never published me.
What?
So that's one of those stories, like we talked about, where something bad happened, but it had a great payoff because on that handshake, I was in like 2 dozen Jewish newspapers across America and even in Canada. And what had made it Jewish about being single is that my mother's first language was Yiddish. She didn't
Mhm.
learn to speak English until she went to school. So my family spoke a little Yiddish, especially when they didn't want the kids to know what they were saying. So I sprinkled each of my stories with a Yiddish word,
Mhm.
such as I'm famished, I'm confused, I don't know what, nothing that people hadn't heard of. But I put the word in, and then I created a glossary. So there was a sidebar to my article with a glossary. So that was my shtick. And after a year, all of the editors and publishers loved that, but until they didn't, which was after a year, they started editing it out. So I started editing it out too. And so it just became a basic slice of life.
Yeah.
I mean, I did talk about dating a little bit, but mostly hanging out with the kids and stuff like that.
Yeah, like of
Yeah,
course, like at that point, like you kind of have your lights change. You're just kind of writing. It's just like, oh, this is fun. Like, and that's incredible how like you get on this handshake agreement, you get given this title, and then completely reneges on it. But like you've capitalized on that, like.
I
And it's just like, well,
did.
here, this is what's happening to me. And then of course, with that kind of title, other newspapers they're going to want a slice of the pie as well, and then
Yeah.
but then it's just like then it turns out it's like, well, actually, the original one never worked out, but here we go. I've still now
But
I've
here
got
we go.
this.
We'll see. And I think for your audience of creatives, that my history is interesting because I really didn't have a game plan. I mean, I was going to be a quilt lecturer, but any door that opened, I walked through.
Yeah.
I just gave it a try. And here's a very interesting PS to the publisher in Cincinnati. When I So the reason that I have a fifth book is because I had that fourth book. So the Bill Nye book was self-published because Pelican Publishing had published my first three books, but then they stopped publishing the kind of stuff that I write. So I looked for a publisher, which is just hell to do, and ultimately self-published. And then a publishing guru told me that I needed a website, so I created a website. And then the web guru said to me, now you need to make people come to your website to see your book on the home page. So now you have to write. It's no longer a column; it's a blog. It's like, are you kidding me? I'm done writing. Okay, so I have to write a blog, and I write two. I figured I could do two a month. Again, back to my 750 word plan, and I can tell your audience in a moment too how to write 750 words, lickety split. But anyway, so I started to write again, and lo and behold, after a time, I had a lot of stories that were evergreen, that were, just were forever. And I compiled them, and that became my fifth book. That became the book that just came out.
Yeah.
But when I started writing these blogs, I got back in touch with that publisher of the newspaper in Cincinnati. And guess what? He publishes me once a month now. I don't have any idea if he remembers what happened in the year 2000. But in 20, he's been publishing me for 5 or 6 years now.
Oh, wow.
So I write 2 stories a month, and I send both to him, and he chooses one and he publishes it. Is that amazing?
That is incredible. That's like a lovely full circle kind of thing, isn't it? Like even you say, he may not remember what happened back then, but for yourself, surely.
I don't know if he does.
But that's still amazing, because that's how that's how you got your start in that kind of form of writing, and writing for newspapers and all, and now it's kind of full circle. Now he's finally published it, unless like the deal itself was, we'll start in 20 years or something. I don't know.
He neglected to tell me that.
Yeah. And so when it came to then blog writing, obviously that's a lot different than writing like a newspaper column, because you go through all this sort of process of editors and kind of a lot of red tape and sort of writing something that's going to go out public and like that kind of in that kind of form. But obviously you have full creative license in terms of what you write when it's on your own blog and your own website. And do you feel that like it's a lot easier to write for a blog than it would be for a column, or is it more in the same almost?
Yeah. In my case, really, what I called a column and what I call a blog are the same thing. It's just a different slice of life now that I'm, a senior citizen and a grandma and all those kinds of things. So it's actually a lot easier because I have so many years of experience. So it's going to tell you about 750 words. So this is my starting point. If I'm stuck and I don't know what, coming up with an idea is hard about what to write about. But once you get the idea, it's easy to do. And here's how. So if you're writing 750 words, that breaks down to 550 word paragraphs.
Okay.
And so you need an introduction, and you need a conclusion, and you need 3 somethings in between. And so if you read my stories on my website, on my blog now, you won't really see that I've done that. But that is how I think it through, especially if I'm stuck. Okay, what am I going to talk about? I don't know. How about this? Well, do you have 3 things to say? Okay, maybe I'll research it a little bit and pull something in. So that's really a very easy way to write and to get started. And also in that, I heard another podcast where a lady said the hardest part of writing was the first sentence, So also in that 5 groups of 150 word theory, if one of the ideas is more poignant, just write that one. You don't have to start at the beginning of the stories. Start with go for the low hanging fruit. Write the one that wants to be written. And it's just so astounding to me. It always has been about writing, the way your brain takes over and does things. That it finds the exact word with the exact nuance that you never knew you knew that word, but there it
Mm-hmm.
is on the page. And the same thing with this. I'll write whatever. I struggled with that first paragraph, and I was like, okay, let's write the third one. And then, oh, something I wrote there just ties into my false start in paragraph one. And it's like, okay, I'm good. So it used to take me 5 days to write my 750 words, and now I'm down to about three.
Brilliant.
Uh-huh. And you need to get people to come to your website. So I
Mm.
also write, I'm a prolific reader, so I write book reviews. So I really want your audience also to join the Book Lovers Club. I review about 3 dozen books a year. And oh my goodness, if I didn't write to some of those authors and send them my review of their book and ask for a blurb on my new book, and oh my gosh, if I didn't get it. So I really just make use of every little crumb that comes my
Oh
way.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a brilliant way to do it. That's a brilliant way to do it because, like, it, it's kind of a two-way street, then, isn't it? Really, like, you're getting your people reading your story, you're reading other people's stories, and it's like it keeps that sort of world alive. I think in this digital age we live in, that I like to talk about all the time, this digital age where everything is all chronically online, you now have this, like, it's like, well, here we go, here's a book you can read. Here's a physical story you can read that is completely, you can switch off for a few hours or a few days and just read something in front of you, and I will do the same back, kind of thing. I think that's a really good way to, and it's a win-win situation, I think, for everybody
Yeah,
involved as well. But I kind of think, though, like, people reading is like, it seems to me that's something that's kind of almost coming back now, because obviously everything, like I say, being so online, and everything all short form blog content and everything like that. But I think reading and books seem to be really, really coming back. I see a lot more people writing books now. A lot more people are, but they're just using different platforms to kind of sell them. But I kind of think the actual physical paperback hard copy of literature is back where it was 10 years ago, for example, which is nice to
yeah,
see. I think it is nice to
yeah,
see.
yeah. Well, especially for those of us like you and I who have books out there.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. So I'm curious about something as well. Like, obviously, you've been writing for such a long time, and obviously, like, with the way that the world has changed over the last 30 years, and now that you're writing blogs on websites and stuff like that. So obviously, with that, it's down to the hook, or like the low hanging fruit. Like, how do you get the everything's all about how do you get your audience's attention within the first few words of a sentence or something like that. Was writing always like that back when you started, or is that something that's only really kind of become a bigger focus in more recent years since the whole short form content?
Yeah, I think that is that things have changed in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
And like on my website, the analytics tell me if somebody stopped reading me in the first 3 seconds or whatever.
Wow.
It's heartbreaking. So
Yeah.
the hook really is important now. And what I used to do, and I still kind of do, because I think that people who subscribe to my, to get my stories, that they know me and they know what it's going to be, so they indulge me a little bit. But I've always like told a story of my life, something that was kind of off in left field, and then segued
Mm-hmm.
into whatever it was I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
And so um, I don't do that as much, but I can do it. I used to always do it, but I can do it because my readers are indulgent. So the story that I just posted on my blog yesterday was about a man that I found on YouTube. He's Robert's Act of Retirement. He's adorable. He's 77, and and I think he's the male version of me, just kind of comforting to hear him talk, or I hope that's the way I come across. I've tried to come across. But I started off my story saying that I'm talking about my friend Sue, who's my walking partner. So we spend a lot of time together. So she knows me better than anybody. And sometimes when we're friends and I'll be telling a story and kind of forget a detail, she'll fill it in because she knows she already heard that story. And we laugh and we call her my external hard drive, you know? So I started with that story with then let me say that Robert in his podcast says that memory is a team sport at his age, you know, that he and his wife remind each other of things. So that was cute unto itself, but I
Yeah.
liked pulling them in with something very personal. And then the rest of the story was Robert, Robert, Robert. So, so anyway, yeah, but I think things really have changed. I think, oh, I've written about that. You know, these aren't my more evergreen stories, but I've written about how WordPress, which is where my website is published, you know, they grade what I write, and they don't always like it because it's supposed to be for like a fifth grade reading
Oh, wow.
level, and it's supposed to have a lot of not just well, it's supposed to have short paragraphs and short words and how much white space is needed. And oh, it really gets wildly happy if you have bullet points and, you know, lists. They want it to be, you know, not dense and not
Mhm.
visually dense. So writing is vastly different
Yeah, I'm
now.
sure. Like that's, and I get because everybody's attention span is a lot different than what it was, especially pre-COVID, because we went from reading paragraphs to sort of needing everything summarized into 3 to 5 seconds. And it's the sort of thing I look back and think, wow, that's actually crazy. Like there are times I just do want to sit and read some. But I actually think though it's one of those things I think it takes to actually writing something yourself to really kind of regain that appreciation for longer form content than um than what's out there now. And like because I would have been very guilty of been scrolling through Instagram, TikTok, just at the short videos and stuff. But like now that I've actually written a book, it's like I'm very much in the sort of camp where I can be like, well, I'm happy to sort of give up the next half an hour to focus on this one individual thing because there is a story to be told. And I think that's kind of what I think it's what most things relate to now. It's like everything is storytelling. That's something that I kind of really like to hammer home is that everything is a story. And I think that there's so much that's missed out on because people don't want to sort of stay past 5 seconds or 5 words,
Yeah,
whatever it may
yeah,
be.
yeah, yeah. Oh, I agree. And yeah, so how beautiful to have a book in hand and to sit down with it, long
Absolutely.
form. Yeah, how
Absolutely.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Lorie, it has
Hmm.
been an absolute pleasure having you on behind the camera. Thank you so much for your time. Been an absolute pleasure. Just before we wrap up, where can the listeners find you and your work?
Well, everything is my full name, Lorie Kleiner Eckert. So my website is loriekleinereckert.com. My Etsy shop is loriekleinereckert.etsy.com. And on my website, you can find, subscribe to receive my blogs, can subscribe to receive my book reviews or whatever. And then on all the social media, I'm on Facebook and X and Instagram and Pinterest and LinkedIn. And in most places, I'm Lorie Kleiner Eckert, but if you Google that platform, Lorie Kleiner Eckert, you'll find me. So Lorie Kleiner Eckert everywhere. And then High on Life, the new book, which does have some pages in the back for you to write your own stories, which are so important. And it does have a new companion journal so you can write your even more of your stories. And those, books are available everywhere and especially easily on Amazon. So Yeah, Amazon.uk, right, for you guys?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yes. Well,
yeah.
definitely be sure to check out Laurie's work, especially if you've enjoyed this conversation, because I know I certainly have. But once again, Lorie, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you. It's great.
And there you have it for episode 94 of Behind the Camera. Huge thank you to Lorie Kleiner Eckert for being this week's guest and for sharing her story. If you'd like to hear more from Lorie, you can check out the links to her work in the description of this episode. Massive thank you to all patrons. Your support is truly appreciated. And as always, if you'd like to stay connected with Behind the Camera, you can also find all of my links in the description, including socials, merch, and for my book, Behind the Camera, The Journey So Far, out now. Thank you for listening, for the support, and for being part of the journey. Until next time, take care, stay creative, and I'll see you soon. But until then, peace.